Hello and welcome to another episode of Destination Uri. And today we're joined by two eminent guests, two local historians. I have Kevin Murphy on my left here, and he's joined also by Una Walsh. And they've come in from the parish of Mullaban to talk to us about a seminal period in our history, the famine period from which ran from 1844, and in particular the South Armagh area suffered during that period, and emigration was rife then, and of course with the port here in Uri and Warrenpoint as well, a lot of local people left the area. And we're going to look at a cameo from that period, which was the sailing of the ill-fated Hannah and the fate of the passengers on board her. And Kevin and Una are going to tell us that story, the very tragic story, and also take an overview of what life was like in that period in our history, and what drove these people to leave their homeland and literally head on an unknown journey to the far side of the world. So, Kevin, yourself and Una have written a book, A Famine Link, the Hannah. Now, I said that the Hannah had left Warrenpoint in April 1849, wasn't it? And maybe you could fill us in from there, Kevin.
Well, the background to this sailing, of course, was the famine from the starvation, basically, from 1845, failure of the potato crop, and then by 1849, a lot of people were getting out. Well, they were the ones who had some money to pay the shipping agent. Like, for example, in South Armagh, we hear of the west of Ireland that the famine was very bad there, and of course we hear about Skibbereen and all that kind of thing. But in South Armagh, in the barony of Orier and the Fuse, it was lamentable destitution, and the landlords, with one or two exceptions, were particularly harsh, and therefore a lot of people both died and emigrated. From 1841 until 1971, the parish of Mullaban, which is officially the parish of Forkhill, lost 70% of its population. So it was an appalling thing. I think from 1841 to 1861, in those 20 years, there were something like 2,600 and some odd people disappeared from the parish, and that would be basically more than the population of the parish now. So it was a fearful time, and the people who went on the ships were the ones who could afford to pay some money,
Now, there was a bit of we talked earlier, Una, about the actual departure date of the ship, and even with that, there's a suggestion that before even these unfortunates left Warrenpoint, they could have been exploited. Isn't that right?
Yeah, well, I think it would have all been exploitation. I mean, Kevin talked about the famine years and about the landlords, and I mean, it's not that it hasn't been documented, because Reverend Gunn Brown, who would have been a Church of Ireland minister, give submissions to the Devon Commission about the landlords of South Armagh, which was a people stepping out, if you like, out of his own tradition to say that. And he said the landlords of South Armagh were exterminators. So that was your first base. Exterminators. So that was your first base, and that really, the people were in that situation where at all levels they had been exploited. So that when they came to the Hannah, when they came to Warrenpoint, the Hannah itself was an exploitation because it was a coal boat. You know, it was a boat that came in carrying a cargo of coal. The coal was taken off, and that's what you put people back into, as you said, for an unknown journey. And to say then that you were maybe had a starting date that was delayed for 3 or 4 days, where people were having to stay in Warrenpoint, they were having to pay money. So how much collusion there was then between the people who owned those houses and the master of the ship. And really, masters of ships seem to be almost able to make all decisions in their own right. It was his jurisdiction. He decided when the boat would go, so he could set that all up. So, you know, those people, and as Kevin said, the people who left, maybe even though it was an ill-fated journey, they were maybe the luckier ones in that they had some means to allow them to leave.
Now, we talked there about the landlords, and Kevin, we know about Jackson in Forkhill, and we know about Chambry and Meg. Who else was involved?
Well, Jackson actually, it was the Jackson estate, but by the time of this period, it was the Alexander family had it taken. It was leased out to them by the Jackson Charitable Bequest, which he left after he died in 1787. Incidentally, the landlord at the time that these people left was Henry Alexander. And interestingly, we discovered later than the book actually, he and his wife and daughters were on holiday in Bologna as these people sailed out. So most of the people in the parish of Forkhill were, the landlord was the Alexanders of Forkhill. There were a few others, the Johnsons, they had the townland of Mafona, the Johnsons of Carrickbroad. Carricknagavna now townland was, it was the Whaley family of Stephen's Green, Buck Whaley's people.
And
cousins,
if you go to Temple Bar, there is still a nightclub called Buck Whaley's.
Yeah, and they owned Temple Bar, and they owned the port of Claddagh and Galway and so on. The original Richard Whaley was a cousin of Oliver Cromwell, so he got a large slice, 20,000 acres in Wicklow and the Central Guard.
People, Kevin, of a good pedigree.
He was of a good pedigree, Richard Whaley, and then his descendant, also Richard Whaley, in the 1760s, he was Richard Chapel Whaley. He was known as Burn Chapel Whaley because he was very zealous at burning Popish chapels. So they were the landlords of Carricknagavna, and then of course you had Anduff and
McGill-Bond.
McGill-Bond family of Armagh, notoriously harsh landlords as well. And of course Chambry was over the mountain a little bit, but he was a byword for repression in this period, in the famine period. He said, for example, that Meredith Chambry said he would leave a race of a horse between the houses on his estate. In other words, he would thin the people out. And fair play to him, he managed.
But to look at the extent of the difference in people, in Bassett's Guide for Armagh for 1888, there's a piece that says Captain Granville Alexander had spent between £7,000 and £8,000 in renovating his extensive residence, Forkhill Lodge. Now this is 1888, that's 40 years post-famine. He spent between £7,000 and £8,000. You know, and you think about the living conditions and what the people on those estates, how they were living, and there's like the magnitude of the gap between what was the landlord people and the peasant people is absolutely enormous.
And you painted a picture there, Una, of the enormous gap and the almost obscene wealth that these people had while their tenants were living in such squalor. But actually, Kevin, could you give us a picture of what life would have been like for these unfortunates at this time?
Yeah, well, you mean the farms were very small. I mean, a big farm would have been 10 acres, and then of course most of them were 3-4 acres. Some of them 1 acres, you know, and of course the labourers and cottiers were below that, and they weren't basically able to get on a boat. I mean, they had absolutely nothing because they depended for payment from the farmers, and they were paid in potatoes and so on. And they had a little garden, but when the potatoes failed, you see, the people couldn't look after themselves. So the labourer or cottier class, they were the ones who suffered most. But when the people of the sort of small farmer class who went on the Hannah could probably scrape up a few pounds, but basically, well, we know the first year that we can get any inkling of what life expectancy was in the parish is 1864 now, which is a bit after the famine. And in 1864, I discovered that life expectancy was 38 years in the parish of Farkhill. And the next year, it actually went down to 37 years and 4 months. So, you know, we think now, and this was like, we're talking about 13 years, 1864 would be 15 years after the Hannah.
Yeah.
So that was the horror of that. I mean,
that was the legacy.
Yes, in 1865, 24 children under the age of 5 died in the parish of Farkhill. Now, you're talking about 2 a month. I mean, it's just an appalling situation. So that's the only reason we can get a picture, because that was the first registry of deaths. So we can only speculate at how awful it was. I mean, people were going to the graveyards and digging shallow graves and lying down in them because they felt that their relatives would be too weak to dig graves when they died. And they shut themselves up in their houses. I have a few cases of that in our parish where they shut themselves up and just closed the door and died.
Literally gave up.
They gave up, yes, they gave up. And several accounts of people being dead along the road. 2 accounts, one of them is my great-grandmother. 2 children arrived at her door. That would be during the famine period. Well, she was married in 1845, just in time for the famine. So these 2 children, their names were Michael Heron, and they came and she gave them oaten bread. But they wandered off. They were last seen eating cabbage roots in a garden at the end of my Lonan in Carricknagavin, and they were never seen again. They wandered away. But funnily enough, the father and mother, he was a linen weaver, and they survived. Another case is in Drummondtee, the 3 Steps in Drummondtee. There was a servant girl there. She was Mackay from Mafoner in Farkhill Parish, and there was somebody sick in the house, and she was being sent up to the chapel in Drummondtee for holy water, and she was afraid to go. And somebody said to her, don't worry, there are only 8 coffins in the chapel tonight. That was in Drummondtee Church. So that gives you some picture of the horror of the thing. You know?
You see, Una, I think that in Newry, we were spared the worst of it because, as you know, Newry was beginning to benefit from the Industrial Revolution, and we had a lot of employment, and it was a commercial. The town was growing as a commercial entity.
It was, and you had the ship canal that had started. You had that, what that had created. You also had the viaduct, and you had the railway starting to bring stuff in. And you're talking about an area like South Armagh, which was a completely rural area. And I mean, you know, even to go to the 1901 census, which has taken you 50 years almost, over the famine, and go in to look at the census, because the census material will give you so much more of a social history than just the family names. You know, it'll give you the housing stock, it'll give you the social standing of the houses, it will give you whether they're attached. You know, if you go into most of the townlands that are in that South Armagh area, you know, you're talking about maybe 3-4 houses out of that whole townland that might have anything other than a thatched roof. You know, so you're going back, and at a time that...
So it was abject poverty.
Yeah, and that's into the 1900s, you know, into another century almost after the famine. But but the whole thing of the land issue and the fact that if people were on a piece of land, that if you did any work to that land, that what the landlord did was, instead of recompensing that, to put the rent up. Do you know that's how the whole thing grew up around the land struggle and the agrarian struggle? It grew up because of that tenure of fixture of tenure,
Yeah.
and the fact that you were actually in a worse place by trying to better yourself.
Yeah, the more work
The
that
more
you did, instead
the
of
more
being,
you did, the more you were penalised.
yeah,
Which
yeah.
is where the whole land situation came from, and was one of the reasons why Reverend Gunn Brown was so firm in his standing against the landlords.
Yeah.
Because there is absolutely no doubt that he was a pacifist and he didn't support any type of insurrection against it. He was speaking purely on a charitable issue, which, if you like, gives it absolutely more standing. You know, because he's not coming from that background of having an axe to grind or being personally involved in it. So, you know, I think the South Armagh area, because of all of that, of course Newry was going to be in a slightly different place. But you know, at the same time, the South Armagh story, I suppose, is a story that still continues to this day in it being a rural identity. You know, slightly different, but still very much a rural area. And if you like, almost that sort of a place apart, being so close to an urban centre.
I would nearly get the impression, Una, that you're saying that you're almost marginalised.
Well, marginalised in some ways, and maybe culturally protected in other ways.
Yeah,
That it left us with what we have largely unchanged and protected, certainly until a time that people appreciated what that was.
Yeah,
Maybe.
yeah.
You know, I think of some of the fine buildings that had been in Newry when I came to school in Newry first, that are no longer
Oh,
there,
yeah.
and that should have been protected.
Terrible.
Yeah, and sometimes
Swathes of the town
sometimes-
actually gone.
Yeah, sometimes remoteness creates its own benefits.
Yeah, oh, no doubt. Well, Kevin, you've painted a picture, and Una has just coloured in as well, of the situation, that the desperate plight that these people were faced with. And could you talk us through then how someone would have made the decision to go for a famine ship, that they would have finally decided, I have to get out of here?
Yeah, well, by the time they went, you see, the path had already been cleared. I mean, Newry was full of shipping agents. They booked with Ferguson of Merchants Quay. James McMahon's shipping agents is still there beside Goss's Garage there. That's the one. And then there were a few more that still exist along the quay there. And the shipping agents were there. Well, now, these people were going to Quebec, but they were going to an area, Perth Westport area in Ontario, but people were going from the South Armagh area to there from the 1820s. And I think we've identified who went first. It was actually a man called Shane McDermott, and he was quite well off, but went for different reasons. So by the time they were going, there was an established group there. So they knew where they were going to.
Sort of, unfortunately, like our young people
Yes.
going to
Yeah.
New
Exactly
York
the
and
same.
Perth.
Exactly
They're
the
going to
same.
where there is an Irish community,
Yeah.
and more so a local one if they have it, which they did have going. So yeah, you go to your own.
Yeah. So there were 20 families from the parish of Arkell represented on this ship. Now, the organisation of it, obviously, they must have met, they must have coordinated the whole thing, and then they would have walked to the port. Now, when they got to the port, and you see, we didn't know this story, but the story came down, an old woman called Annie Quinn, who was a cousin of my mother's from Carrignagavna, and she told the story. She lived to be almost 106 years old, and incidentally, the last speaker of Irish in South Armagh that she got from her people.
And when did Annie pass away?
1997. She was born on the day Parnell was buried. So she told the story, but the reason that we knew anything about the story was that her grandmother was a woman called Catherine Grant from the townland of Tullymacreeve, and her brother Henry Grant went on this ship. But the story that came down in Carricknagavna was that this family, Grant family, had 5 children. And when they went to the port, now we didn't know where the port was, the eldest girl, who was 12 and had spent a lot of her time down with her aunt Catherine Grant, who was married to Ned Quinn of Carricknagavna, my mother's people, and she refused to go. And she held on to Ned Quinn, who was a brother of my great-grandfather. And she cried and wouldn't go, and eventually they allowed her to stay. So she came back to Carricknagavna with her aunt and her husband, and whenever the ship hit the ice, the other 4 children were drowned. And the story came back because of this girl, and the story was that the wife bound her husband's feet with her petticoat. It was a platen petticoat, it was hard linen. She got it in strips and bound his feet, and she reckoned that that's what saved them while they were out on the ice. So this girl, word must have come back eventually, and this girl went out to them 3 years later. Now we knew this, but we didn't know where the boat was coming from or sailing to. It was only in 2003 when a man called Paddy Murphy and his wife Jane from Ontario arrived with myself and Una, and he said, "I'm Paddy Murphy and I'm looking for my ancestors." And there he had the list and of passengers, and immediately there was Henry Grant and wife, 4 children lost. And I knew immediately it was the same ship. So the little bit fragment of the oral, the story, had come down, and it linked up immediately, and of course it was the
and I think, you know, if there's one lesson to be learned from the doing of the Hannah, it is about that oral tradition, that the most valuable thing you have in any area is that oral tradition, and the fact that stories were handed on, because only that piece of story, when Paddy Murphy came first, we were just finishing off a book, because we had put in Townland Stones, and we were finishing off a book around the Townland, and we thought, right, do we stick in 1 page about this, just have some record of it, and then it didn't naturally fit. It was a water story, if you like, and all our stories in the other book were land stories, because they were all townlands, and we didn't know where it would fit in, and one wouldn't help the other, and we left it to one side. But it burned. It sort of burned then, because it was there then, and you needed to do something with it. But only that fragment of the oral tradition was there when Paddy Murphy came. Only that was there. It never would have been followed on. Now, the fact that Canada had much better records than us was a great help, and the book couldn't have happened only for the information that Paddy Murphy and Jane were able to bring with them, and quite a lot of research that they had already done on their side. But the other important thing was that the book couldn't have happened either, only that the parish of Forkhill had an 1821 census. So that the people that were appearing on the ship's manifest in 1849, that we could actually place them in their townlands with the correct ages and all in the 1821 census. So if that oral tradition had to be in another parish, even though the rest of the information came from Canada, you still couldn't. You may have published a book, but it would have been purely an anecdotal book.
Yeah.
That you could not have stood over, but we could actually make it an absolute certainty by having the 1820
Cross-referencing.
and cross-reference.
And
but
Kevin,
the oral tradition was the key.
And Kevin, would you expound on what Una has just told us? Would you explain to the viewers watching this the significance of that 1821 census?
Well, I mean, this is an amazing document. There are only about 18 parishes in Ireland have any, some of them only fragments. There's only one full 1821 census in the 6 counties here, and that's Derryvullen in Fermanagh, fragments of Kilmore, County Armagh, but that's it. And none at all in Munster exist. But luckily enough, this copy was kept in the boardroom of the Jackson Charitable Bequest in Forkhill, and eventually we got our hands on it and we were able to copy it in the original handwriting. But as an historian from Derry said to me, Bobby Forrest, he said he was very jealous of this, and he said, this is like shining a torch into the dark. You know, by looking at the 1821 census, we were able to get back to people who were born in the 1760s. So it was a massive document, and the younger children then were appearing in Ontario. And when you looked at the census of Ontario, not just as well as the boat, but when we broadened it out, these people were appearing, and then we found them dying out there and what they did and so on. So it was a massive document. So that when we looked at pictures from out there, for example, James Ward and his wife Mary McKinley, now they weren't sure out there if that was him or his son. And then we knew Mary McKinley was from Clonakil and he was from the townland of Mafona, which were adjoining townlands. And when I brought the picture, they sent over the picture from Canada. When I brought the picture to my aunt, who was born in 1917, she's still alive, and she immediately looked at the picture, and I said, do you recognise any of the faces? And she said, well, I don't know the man, but the woman has a McKinley face on it. You see. So this verified the situation. And so that we were able to then clearly show that this was Mary McKinley and this was James Ward. James Ward was pretty heroic when the ship hit the ice. He was very athletic, and he jumped back and forward from the ship to the ice and back and forward and rescued a lot of children out of the ice. So the 1821 census was absolutely crucial. And of course, it's crucial because when we get the Registry of Deaths, which started in 1864, we can trace these people dying here. And of course, with better records in Canada and the States, we can trace them out there. So it's an invaluable document.
Right.
But, and even on a wider context, you know, it means that children that are in our parish can trace their people if they know that their people have always been there. They can move now from 2013. They can move back through census material. They can go online, get 1911, 1901 census material. They can go into Griffith's valuation, also online in 1864. That'll show their people there. They have an 1821 census. So a child in our parish can go back into the 1700s with their own people. You know, without leaving the house. You know, and all of that sort of value material being stored in Prony, which of course is good and it should be stored. But the important thing is that that children are involved in all of this, that children can see where their own lineage are coming from and that they can do that themselves. And it also highlights, you know, in a present day situation, the absolute importance of townlands and of people being part of their own community. And knowing their own community. Do you know that
having a sense of identity.
Yes, but yes, and knowing the people that were around them, and the importance of that for young people in feeling a sense of pride in themselves and who they are. Because the one thing, as you go globally, and we talked about immigration and the fact that we are now back in the situation that the famine link was in, where we are exporting our young people all of the time. The one thing that no matter where you go that's unique to you is the core of yourself. And that's your own genetic makeup and the makeup of the people that surrounded you, that nurtured you, that got you to where you are. So townlands, if you like, you know, the oral tradition was the link of the Hannah. The link of all of that is your townlands and your sense of who those are and where they are.
So, Kevin, we have the emigrants have walked from, we'll say, Mullabon to Warrenpoint. They've boarded the ship. We know that it was a coal boat. We know that they'd converted the ship with bunks, etc., to take the people back. So, would you give us a picture, Kevin, of the conditions that these people would have been afforded when they went on board the ship, starting with the number of people who actually travelled?
Yes, well, there were upwards of 200 people on the ship for a start. We, according to the records, there were 127 saved and about 55 lost on the ice. You know, either drowned or frozen to death. But the ship itself was a horror. Of course, the below decks was very low, and this was a coal boat from Maryport in Cumbria. And it was captained by a gentleman called Curry Shaw.
I think we'd say
Gentleman
gentleman in
wouldn't be the
inverted
correct,
inverted
gentleman
commas.
in very much inverted commas. He was 22 years old, but the account that we got later from other people, because other people turned up with accounts even after the book, but he was one day out of Warren Point, and they had 3 wooden latrines, and he threw them overboard. He kept the hatches down, and the people were confined below deck.
In the hold.
Yes, and he basically there also record of him attacking some of the young women. An account was given by a Mrs. Murphy. She was the ancestor of this Paddy Murphy who came,
Yeah.
and she testified that he was attacking the women in their bunks and so on. So he was a notorious character. So that when they left on the 3rd or 5th of April, there's variance about the date. It was booked to go on the 1st of April. So he may have been in collusion with some of the boarding houses in Warren Point, as was usual for this type of thing. But when they hit the ice on the 29th of April in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, on the back of the book they have a big iceberg type thing, and it wouldn't have been, it was pack ice, it wouldn't have been that high. But when they ran into it at about 4:30 in the morning, the ship went down in about 40 minutes. And he and the first and second mate jumped into one of the longboats and took off. He grabbed the ship's log and compass and so on, and as he was coming out he shouted, "Keep quiet and I will save you all." But he was really actually jumping into the boat. Now the ship's surgeon is Surgeon Graham from McGilligan in Derry, and it's kind of interesting that his brother was the perpetual curate in the Church of Ireland in Meath, St. Luke's in Meath at the time, and he dived into the water to try and stop them leaving. But Captain Curry Shaw lashed at him with a cutlass. He broke his ankle jumping onto the ice to try and stop them, and the passengers pulled him back onto the ice. So they were out on the ice from 4:30 odd in the morning. Most of them were in night attire, so they were in a terrible state. And it was 5 o'clock that evening when they were spied by a ship called the Nicaragua with a Captain William Marshall. He was from a place called Clovelly in Devon. His house is still there, incidentally. And he spied them on the ice.
And he was a gentleman.
He was an amazing character. He was an evangelical Methodist. And he was one of those rare things. He was actually was a Christian, you know. And he said he was pulling in to rescue them, and his crew virtually mutinied because the danger of losing their own ship.
Yeah.
But he had a false bow, which he let down on chains, you know, to protect against the ice. So eventually he persuaded the crew, and his autobiography has since turned up, and he's very interesting account of the rescue and so on. And eventually he pulled in, but his ship was holed, and he had to move the cargo to tip it up so that the carpenter could repair the hole in the side of the ship before he could rescue anyone. Then he put down ladders and ropes for them, but he discovered that they were so numbed with the cold.
Yeah.
And he had to lasso them, sometimes 2 and 3 at a time. And he got them round the waist, sometimes round the ankles, and hauled them on board. And he has a horrifying account of what happened there, you know. So one captain was an absolute vagabond. He took off, and the one who came was an amazing man.
Now, to get back to the surgeon, Graham, and you mentioned the perpetual curate, his brother, and May, and it seems that he had an affinity with the passengers because Graham, the surgeon, because of his brother, he had a type of affinity, hadn't he?
Yes, it would seem so, but he was an amazingly heroic man.
Yeah, yeah.
And when he got to Quebec, eventually he testified against Captain Curry Shaw, and died in the infirmary in Quebec.
With fever.
Well, he died from the frostbite and the effects
right.
of his, yeah.
But what I meant to say to you was the surgeon, the brother who was the curate, he had a close relationship with Chambry, the landlord, hadn't
That's
he?
right. And there's one account of him being the ribbon man who shot Chambry in 1852 as well. Shot at him and shot his hat off while he was sitting in the house at the fire.
But then I suppose you can't really take history out of its context either, because he would have had little opportunity to have anything else other than a close relationship with Chambry, because Chambry, as the landlord, really had the Protestant clergy in his pocket.
That's
you know,
right, yeah.
so they would have really had to stand up and be on his side anyway. So,
That's right.
you know, it may not have been that might have been his natural inclination, but
It may not have been.
no, you can't judge that either.
But he was from McGilligan in County Derry.
Yeah.
And their father, Surgeon Graham, and Reverend Graham's father wrote a history of the Orange Order, which is still available. So that's a kind of an interesting aside. But eventually Captain Marshall rescued 127 passengers and I think 9 crew from the ice.
Now, there was an interesting story there too, Kevin, in that Curry Shaw actually had reached port. He was the first to arrive in port, and he declared that everyone on the ship had been lost.
That's right. He and the first and second mate were picked up by a ship called the Margaret Pollock, and he arrived in Quebec and he reported that all were lost, that the Hannah was down, and the very next day Captain Marshall pulled in with the survivors. Not all the survivors, he transferred to a few other ships because his ship was overburdened by them, and he arrived with 127 passengers. So that was a big blow to Curry Shaw.
Well, Curry Shaw's would have suited him better had everyone perished.
Exactly.
Oh yeah.
Because it wouldn't have shown what he had done.
And
had everyone perished.
what was the what were the repercussions for Curry Shaw, Una?
Well, certainly there was some type of a trial, because there is reports of both the surgeon and the captain who had saved them, given evidence against him. But there is nothing to show that there was any conviction from it, or that he really suffered anything for what he had done.
And in fact, he protested his innocence,
he protested
didn't he?
his innocence,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
That it wasn't, he hadn't abandoned ship. He had originally gone into the boat to try and get help and to save other people. So, and it's most definitely, had they perished, it would have left it an easier story for him. But it doesn't seem as if he really had anything untoward afterwards from him.
No remorse, because he wrote a cheeky letter to the Quebec Mercury, to the paper, you know, justifying
about
himself.
scandalising him.
Yeah.
And what would be what is the legacy of the Hannah today in that area? As
Well, I think-
regards the survivors and what they've left behind them.
Well, I think the nicest piece is the quote that's on the back of the book, where Paddy Murphy had said, "We call this place Little South Armagh," because they have never, that group of people as a people have never forgotten the area that they left. And we have photographs in the book from the graveyards, and you could almost transcribe that graveyard and put it into the graveyard in Mullaban, because the names are there, the headstones are there. On the 150th celebration last October for St Mary's Church in Mullaban, we unveiled a plaque that's on the wall, and it's to the survivors of the Hannah. So that we have that link, that permanent link
Yes.
now, I think, between our parish and the parish that they went to. But, you know, I think on the honour and the pride that we have in South Armagh, for another group of people in a different part of the world to want to call their area Little South Armagh, I think for us was
Yes.
really very, very important.
Oh yeah, they're fantastic.
Yeah.
So really, it's Kevin. It's really a microcosm
Yeah.
of South Armagh.
That's right, because when the people came from there, and several of them have come now, they couldn't believe when they looked in the graveyard. It was exactly the same graveyard as their graveyards in Perth and Westport, and the same names.
Yes,
And
yes.
ironically, you see, the people from the parish of Farkhill who went out there intermarried out there, just the same way as they intermarried
Yeah.
here. And just a very recent one, there was a McCann gathering in Mullaban, in T-Cullen, there a few weeks ago, and there were 154 people at a meal there. They were from here, from Canada, the States, and so on. But these people came, some of the people, McCann descendants from Westport, came to it, and they were, I took them around, and one of them was living in Ottawa. She was a Susan Masval, which wouldn't give you much of a clue of South Armagh, but she was a descendant of this McCann family. And I was in correspondence with a man in Ottawa called Dan Hamilton, whose mother was Powers from Anduff in our parish, and she's 98 years old, and she was born in Stanleyville in the same area just beside Westport. And so I was telling this woman about it because she now lives in Ottawa, even though she's from that area in Ontario. And she got in contact with this Dan Hamilton, and she's discovered that they're related, you see, because they share the same great-great-grandparents. And it's all a community very much like here because of intermarriage, all that. So these links keep going on, and every year now, and every so often, somebody new appears who weren't necessarily on the boat, but heard of this story. And their people may have gone in the 1840s earlier, 1830s, and they are linking up now as well. So there's a community. This man McCann, he's Damien McCann. His people were from Mullaban. He lives in Cleveland, Ohio now. But he said his brother went up driving through this area, North Crosby, Ontario, around the Westport, Stanleyville, Perth area. And he stopped on the road and he met two men. And he asked them, said he was McCann, and they were also McCann. And their roots were from here. And they have up on a monument there, Little South Armagh. And one of them, he was in his 50s, he said, and he said, yeah, I said, I know my people came from all that, but what is this Little South Armagh? He had lost what exactly this was, you know. But he was descended from the McCanns of Shanroe, Mullaban. So there's a whole community out there, and they're beginning to get more and more contact now. So it's a never-ending story, and I think could be replicated maybe all over Ireland because of situation. And from one little oral little bit of a story
that came down.
Yeah.
Well, Kevin, there's a lovely very plain, simple stone out in Carriff to the Hannah. How did that originate?
But Mickey McGuigan put that.
Yeah, Mickey would have. Some of the people on the boat would have been from the townland of Carriff.
And Mickey's own people were on it,
Mickey's
yeah.
people were on it. And the first church, actually, the first mountain church built out there was built by the McCann brothers, who were from the townland of Carriff. So the Mickey McGuigan would have been the man who put the stone up, and Mickey would do quite a lot of that local history that is very, very local to that townland, and would be, I think, the last person in that area that would have some of those very local oral stories that others may not have. So Mickey would have always commemorated in some way anything that was there around that history of the Carriff area. So that's how that one came about. And as I say, then the one that's in the graveyard was just put up to as part of the celebrations for the building of St Mary's Church in Mullaban, which was 150 years built last year.
There was also a house that featured in the documentary. Was that Paddy Murphy's relatives?
Yes.
That's right. Yeah, that was the house that John Murphy came from, you see. And it was known as Michal Owens, or Michal Owens, the people said, but it was Michal Owens, Michal, son of Owen. And Michal Owen died in 1894, and he was a brother of John Murphy on the Hannah, you see. And they lost two children. And this is where the story of the twins floating away came from, that Murphy family. Paddy Murphy's great grandfather, Bernard Murphy, was a 2-year-old child, and he was pulled out of the water by this Mrs. Grant. She thought it was one of her children, but it wasn't. It was her neighbour's child. And these people were all very close neighbours. They were from a small group of townlands. For example, Stanleyville, Ontario, is named after the Stanley family of Fort Hill. So if you go to Fort Hill, just beyond the church there, that's still Stanley's Hill, even though there are no Stanleys now in Fort Hill.
Yeah.
But that's what Stanleyville was named after, you see. So, and if you go to that area, they have all the roads are named after the families, and Murphy Road, Burns Road, all that, Mackay's Road, all that type of thing. So, it's a pretty strong link, you know.
Very good, but a tragic tale. But you know, in many ways, when you listen to what has evolved from it, there's been a lovely legacy, you know.
There has, you know, and even for, you know, the descendants of Captain Marshall,
Yes.
because they had gone in, they had, as has had Paddy Murphy, they had a part of an oral history that had come down through their family, that they didn't have a lot of bones around either, and they had gone in and found the Famine Link book on the internet, and did some investigation, and they had actually come here then to meet up with some of the survivors, the families of some of the survivors that went on the other side. And it was a very, I would have to say, it was a very
lovely.
emotional
Yep.
meeting, you know, he was very proud, I think, that night in the chamber.
Because he's an evangelical Methodist as well as his great grandfather William Marshall, you see.
And where is this man from, Kevin?
He lives in Wales now, Alan Evans and his wife Barbara, and they came over, and so he saw this in the Irish American magazine, in the book, and he rang up T. Cullen, and I happened to be there, and he said he was descended from Captain, and I thought first it was Curry Shaw, but he said no, he wasn't being. But it turned out that Captain Marshall was given an inscribed goblet, about that size, a silver goblet, inscribed for rescuing these people. And Alan Evans arrived here with the goblet.
Right.
He still has the goblet and Captain Marshall's portrait. And then I was corresponding with him for quite a while, and he knew that Captain Marshall wrote an autobiography, but he couldn't get his hands on it. And one day he thought it disappeared in the London Blitz with his grandmother. But one day he was on to a librarian in Bradford, and he's researching Methodism himself, you know. And he mentioned to this librarian, had he ever heard of Captain Marshall? And the librarian said, well, it's funny, 2 days ago I had his autobiography in my hand. So he sent me the autobiography, and this is a section of it here, and I'll give it to you, where Captain Marshall gives his own account of rescuing the people. So he came over here, and the council put on a civic reception, and we had 31 people who had from here who had relatives on the boat to meet him, and it was a very good.
It was a very emotional meeting for him. He really, I think, you know, felt very proud of what Captain Marshall had done,
and rightly so.
And that he was there in the area that the people had come from, that he could meet family that were belonging to some of those people, and you know, even to be able to trace all of that down to present day is quite a wonderful story. And that's the post story, if you like.
Yeah.
And there are always bits, and as Kevin said, the number of people who have dispersed families that are now making contact with each other in Canada because of this is a whole other story.
That's right, and in the States.
Yeah.
People have got on from Wisconsin because they moved on from Westport by bullock cart to Wisconsin, and there's a whole section there who trace themselves back to our parish as well. So they have got in contact, and so the internet has been amazing.
Oh,
you know.
yeah.
So we're it's a very it's a massive story.
So
And,
it's just like really dropping a stone in the pond, and the ripples are spreading.
And those ripples will continue to spread. You know, I suppose the putting down of the book or the putting down of any story in print is only the start of any story.
Yeah.
And somebody needs to put that down to start that effect to happen.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's really what it was. But it would be massive thanks to Paddy Murphy, who's passed away.
He's passed away.
Since the book was done. It would be massive thanks to him, because it could not have happened without him.
The film
and
was
Jane.
made by the BBC, and Gala Film of Montreal. Here it was Ice Immigrants by the BBC, and Captain Marshall's descendant Alan Evans and his son went out to the ice to film.
Yeah, I saw the documentary.
Yeah,
It was a powerful piece of film, and you know, just you're after documenting there a lovely legacy to those people who were lost, and as well to the very necessary survivors who have given us the story that has come down. But earlier, Una, you talked about the sense of identity and the sort of the hidden treasures of South Armagh. And one of the best days that I had in recent years was going on one of the Ring of Gullion trips from the museum here in Uri, and you were the tour guide. And it really was right from the drive past the viaduct right into South Armagh. I think there was 23 or 4 stops from memory, and it was a really, really enjoyable trip. And those trips have been expanded on, aren't they?
Yeah, well, the Ring of Gullion are trying to place 3 or 4 of them every year, and I think, you know, possibly it's something that could be looked at then, maybe, you know, in some way commercially, that people, you know, that they ran maybe even once a month and people could just turn up for them. You know, I suppose for tour guiding or for taking people around, you know, one of my earliest memories is my father standing in an old street in Tullydonnell and looking round and saying, "Aren't yous a blessed people? Now look where yous are born." And it is that sense of, you know, the recognition of what you have. You know, I've stood with primary 7 children at Anamar Court Cairn, which is one of the best examples of a court cairn in all of Ireland. And I've said to them, look, if people are coming from Cork and Kerry to come to see this, and it's in your field, you know, yous own this. And that sense of wonder for children to know that they have something that's in their community that other people don't have, that they have to come there to see it. You know, it's something that we need to instill back into our own young people. But
But of course, we were very lucky in a, you know, I went around with his father, Jim Murphy, and his cousin Owen Keenan, and my own father was also an encyclopedia of the local area, and their knowledge was amazing. Like, I mean, they talked about 300 years ago as if it was yesterday. And then, of course, Michael J. Murphy, the folklorist and writer from Drummondtee, who did unbelievable work. So we were very lucky to, I think Patrick Kavanagh put it well, these were the last of the uneducated, in inverted commas again, the uneducated intellectuals, you know. Kavanagh said that about himself. He said, I flew to knowledge without going to college. They had an encyclopedic knowledge of their own area, and I was very lucky to know them. So
I call those type of people, and I'm very lucky to have access to a few of the older people in Uri. I refer to them as walking reference books.
oh yeah,
unbelievable.
You know, and the sad thing is that unless we do what the type of thing we're doing today, you know, when those people pass on, that chunk of history goes with them.
Well, myself and Una are trying to stay another while, you know.
but it's about, I think it's about working with young people, and not, you know, that it's important that if there are historical groups, that they don't just talk to other people who know it. You know, it's important that if you're doing history, that you do it in a way that's accessible to young people, that you're engaging in young people. You know, if you take a child out and you stand up beside Ballykeel Dolmen and you look at the dolmen and you start to talk about fairies, or, you know, the first time I went to the passage grave at the top of Slieve Gullion, I didn't know it was a passage grave. I went to the Callia Bearer's house. I went to the old woman's house. Now, that was enough at that stage, because at that stage then it was to know it was on the top of Slieve Gullion and to know how to get to it.
Yeah.
The wider knowledge of it being an actual passage grave exactly on the same lines as Newgrange would come later. It's about engaging with the child. It's about having them in Myra Castle, you know, and them saying to you, did princesses live here? Yes, princesses live there. The fact that it was Lord Mountjoy and that he was chasing Hugh O'Neill, that will all come.
Yeah.
But it's about getting them to the places. It's about them being part of that. It's about those older people that have that, passing it on. It's about keeping the oral tradition.
Yes. And the
It's
key
about
to
talking.
it is people have to get into the schools. Primary schools have to take this up, you know. I've been in one school this year in Drummondtee, and the children, you know, they love stories. I mean, and they're living in the middle of stories. And I think, you know, that the primary schools in South Armagh, and everywhere, of course, should be looking at their own area. And if the teachers don't know enough about it, well, then they can get a few people in who do.
Well, it's significant that you've mentioned that, Kevin, because with the Maritime group that I'm involved with, we have actually been we have been doing just that. There's 22 local primary schools, and we started off in Forkhill, and back in February, and we have done, I think to date, 17 as far as Ballyk.
Which is brilliant.
That's great,
You know, and we're getting in, and you realise, as you say, Una, the children, when you ask them even, where's the Newry Ship Canal? Show them a photograph of the canal. Where's the Newry Ship Canal? And you're lucky if 10% of them know. But as soon as you show an image of one of the two shopping centres, nearly every hand goes up. I go there with mommy and daddy.
Yeah.
But they don't know anything about the stretch of water outside
They
the
must
door.
be exposed to it, you see, and they will not know about their local area unless they're exposed to it. And this is more and more crucial now with the worldwide media, you know. We need,
There's so much going on.
That's correct. So we need, it's more and more urgent, and the schools have to be involved in this. So hopefully that will happen more and
But
more.
the problem is as well that if you have, usually the educator of the local history or the family history in any unit is the grandparent. Because, when you have young children, when you're a parent with young children, your focus is, getting them fed and getting them dressed and getting enough money to keep everything right. When you're a grandparent, that's a whole, you're looking at a third generation, and there comes that sense of urgency in you to tell them stuff and to tell them about their own local area. Now, if you have a grandparent that doesn't know it themselves, that's entirely lost to that complete family unit. And we found that with the townlands, that was one of the big reasons of starting to put up the townland stones, that you had within every townland a small group of older people who knew where the boundaries were.
Yep.
Children might have known their own townland, they may have known that the next townland was that, but they didn't know where the boundaries crossed. And so all of that was only in the hands of a handful of people. And if you allowed it to go on for another 20 years, it would almost be gone. So we put up townland boundary stones. So now as you go through our parish, when you're leaving one townland, the stone tells you the name of the townland you're going into, and if you're coming up the road, it tells you it on the other side of it. So, it's a marker put down there. It has created a whole new sense of urgency around the townlands. So sometimes it's about doing the visual. Putting something there, just like it was putting the story of the hen out there and look at what happened after that. It's putting the stone down and create a whole new sense for a whole new generation of people. But definitely, Kevin talked about being lucky. We were lucky. We grew up in houses where that oral tradition was still so strong.
Absolutely.
That you didn't hear, nobody sat down to tell you the stories. You heard them that often. There were smaller houses, you were in the one space, people were coming out in, stories were talked about today, tomorrow, the day before. You heard it so constantly that you felt that you were there when the stories happened.
That's right, because my father talked about a woman in our townland called Mary Lamb. And Mary Lamb had a son called Patrick McGill, and he died when he drank a noggin of grots and so on. And I thought my father virtually knew this Mary Lamb and her son, and I knew all about him, and he married and everything. And I just knew he was maybe before my father's time, but he would point out her house and her well and all this type of thing. And I had a whole story about her and the local landlord and so on. And when I got the 1821 census, in 1821, Mary Lamb was 62 years old. Her son was 22 years old, and the stories that I heard about his birth and all were from 1799. It was a shock to me because I thought, well, like my father didn't exactly remember her, but it was close to him. And I nearly could see her. But by 1828, the Tithe Plotman books, she was dead. So she was 62 in 1821. And I thought, I knew her.
But
So
that was to say, when we went outside Crossmaglen as children, the first thing my father did was start by Corliss Grove as I did Rove, which was a story about the Corliss Mitchells, a football team, and it goes on as a local ballad. It lined out the team, so I knew at that stage when I was born, and this was in the 60s, that it was the Cross Rangers. So I thought the Corliss Mitchells played when my dad was playing football. And when I found out later, the Corliss Mitchells set up in 1889 and they were only there for 18 months. But I knew all the names. I could line out the Corliss Mitchells football team.
Yeah.
And that, again, is going back to the importance of the local ballads.
Yeah.
Because history books record the big events. But local ballads and local pieces of poetry record the important local events and the social history of an area. So that every child, I'd say if you went into the town of Crossmaglen now, such is their belief in the Crossmaglen Rangers and the ballads that were written down through the years about the Rangers, that if you were picking a young fella of the day in Cross, he could nearly line out the Rangers team of the 40s.
He could, yeah.
Because it's in the local ballads. You know, the ballad that Michael Waters had written, who was one of the people in jail for the Crossmaglen conspiracy, he had written a ballad about the landlord putting a clock in Crossmaglen, a dummy clock. The hands didn't move. The people had wanted a clock to put over their meeting house, and he had made little of them by putting up a wooden clock with painted hands. And Michael Waters had written a ballad about all the other important things that could happen across the world, but Crossmaglen was a place where time stood still because the hands never moved on the clock.
10 to 2. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And that to this day is still a ballad that people would know.
Yeah.
You know, you go into Creggan and people will quote you, you know, the piece about Johnson of the Fuse, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, save us from Johnson, Lord of the Fuse. And Johnson hanged Seamus Moore McMurphy in 1750. But that piece, those 4 lines of that ballad are still known in the area. So, you know, they're the important things at local level, is retaining those ballads and collating those.
Like you can go back, there's a mountain in our townland, Carricknagavney, where your own ancestors came from. You're a very lucky man.
Where's
the
the money?
mountain-
Where's the money, Kevin?
We don't deal in money. We are in higher currency than money. But the mountain is called Slievenagapel, Mountain of the Horses, you see. And my father told a story. It got its name because when the Norman invasion came in 1169, 1170, they pushed up as far as Castle Roach, as far as the border there, which is a borderland still. And our people used to sneak down, and the story was told in our house by my father and the other older men, and the land was very boggy and their horses would get bogged down. Our people used to sneak up behind them, and he said, you know, they had this armour on them, but underneath the neck you could lift it up and stick in a knife, slit their throats, topple them off their horses, and our people stole the horses and hid them behind this mountain. And it's still known as Slievenagapel. Now this is from the 1230 Roach Castle was built. So you're talking about 12th, 13th century story. And it was told so well around our fireside that I could nearly see the horses. It was that good. So it's just amazing how...
And even today, is it Slievenagapel?
Oh yes,
Oh, yeah,
Slievenagapel, yeah, Mountain of the Horses. But that's where it got its
The
name.
name has retained.
Yeah. And that's in just behind where your ancestors come from. It's Slievenagapel. And if you come out someday, I'll take you to the top of it and we might see horses.
Very good. Well, on that note, Kevin and Una, can I just say thank you very much for giving us a really insightful account of not only the Hannah, but of the background to the whole awful tragedy. But again, showing us that sometimes, as in this case, good triumphs over evil, you know. So Kevin and Una, thanks very much.
Right, James,
Thanks
thank
a lot.
you.
No problem. There you are.
Thank you, Kevin.